Well, here I am again. Today is the 26th of June in the year 2018. As you know, I've been doing this recording in sort of fits and starts so that I would be able to collect my own thoughts as to what I wanted to talk to you about. I want to tell you a little bit about my career interest and experience because it was a very important part of my life at one time. As I told you, I think, I graduated from Iowa State in March of 1945. That was a little bit later than my own class, which would have graduated in June of 1944. But I was married in September of 1944 and went with my husband, Bob, to his first assignment as a commissioned officer in the Army, and was there with him for 6 weeks until he went overseas. Then I went back to college, finished my 1 quarter, which was only a quarter of home management experience, which was an interesting time because in those days, young girls in college in home economics were all required to have 1 quarter of experience in a home management house, where a small baby was brought in from the State Department of Child Welfare, and we had an actual baby to take care of for the 6 weeks period that we were assigned to that particular course. So then I left Iowa State in March of '45 and went directly to Washington, where I began my first job with an organization called Government Services Incorporated. And this was a large food service company that provided food service in 57 federal locations located throughout Washington. I was hired as an assistant supervisor, and very shortly thereafter became a supervisor. And then a little bit later on, I became a traveling manager. In other words, when a woman went on vacation in the management level of one of the cafeterias, I was sent in to fill in for her while she was gone. That was a rather stressful job because I worked very diligently at it, and many of the people that I worked with were black people. And in those days, the race relations was very tense in Washington particularly. And so I was very defiant. One of the men in our department was a shop steward with one of the professional unions, which meant that he was very high in the ranking of the black leadership. Well, I worked at that I went into that in March of '45, and I stayed with the government services until Bob came back from Europe, which was June of '46. Actually, it was almost 2 years when you figure the calendar on that. But anyhow, the reason that I was hired so quickly was because of my Aunt Lillian, who, as I told you, had achieved a considerable amount of professional reputation and acclaim in her field in foods chemistry. I think I told you about the fact that she began the actual baby food industry. The Gerber family, who lived in Fremont, Michigan, were actually producers of pie cherries at that time in a very large way. They had a huge manufacturing plant in Fremont. And at any rate, Mrs. Gerber became very friendly with my aunt, who had gone there as a foods chemist to clarify or to verify that the plant was being run in a very, perfectly acceptable manner from the standpoint of health and sanitation. Well, Aunt Lillian got interested in talking to Mrs. Gerber. She had 5 children, I believe, and the famous picture of the Gerber baby was actually one of her children. And so my aunt was interested in the fact that she had to push food through a strainer, some kind of a sieve in her kitchen in order to get the food ground up fine enough to feed to an infant. So Aunt Lillian convinced the Gerber family that if she would be allowed to set up a test kitchen in the Gerber factory to try to find a way to make baby foods more acceptable and more attractive to young mothers, that it would be a very worthwhile thing to do. Well, as a result of that, to make a long story short, Aunt Lillian developed the first 25 brands or varieties of the Gerber baby food before she left Gerber 25 years later. And Gerber, of course, became the pioneer in baby food, in the baby food business. Well, to make a long story rather short, my aunt was a delightful woman, and she demanded a great deal of respect throughout her field, and was a very well-known person. Of course, that was why I got that job in Washington, because of a friend of hers who actually was president of the company. So you can see why she became somewhat of a role model for me. Well, I went on from there. Of course, when Bob came back from Europe and we started our family, it was some years before I returned to the field. But when I actually had the opportunity in about 1962, when we got ready to come back to where was I? Oh, yes, when in 1963, when we became interested in living in New Mexico, I became interested in developing, re-entering the field. And so I had to take a couple courses at New Mexico Highlands. One was in accounting and one was in labor economics, in order to qualify me as a registered dietitian, because all of my college work had been in the field of institution management, which was very similar in terms of large quantity food operations, but it lacked some of the technical aspects. So at any rate, I became a dietitian at the New Mexico State Hospital when we moved to Las Vegas, New Mexico. And I was there for about 8 years, and ended up being the senior dietitian there at the hospital. that was a very interesting experience. And of course, working in a mental hospital gave me a whole new insight into the nature of mental illness. After I left the hospital in 1968, I was somewhat dissatisfied because by that time politics in New Mexico had become very principal in the life of and times of the people who were employed by the state, which of course I had been because I was at the hospital. So I left there, and for a very short time, but a very meaningful period, I was a caseworker with the welfare department and worked with young women who were single mothers. And that was a very maturing and interesting experience. Then I had an opportunity in that, and shortly after I began to work at the state, I had an opportunity to work for the State Department of Education in their Child Nutrition Division. And that became the very special part of my life because I loved my work. And I became a state director of child feeding programs, which included school breakfast and lunch and all kinds of summer feeding and special programs. It was a very large program, and I had a fine staff of people working for me. And we visited all the schools throughout the state to be sure that they met all the federal standards. I had a very wonderful experience, opportunity to be affiliated with the National Legislative Committee of the American School Food Service Association. So as state director, I became associated with all the other state directors throughout the country. And this was a very significant part of my career for a number of years. In fact, even after I retired, they called me back to spend some time working as a consultant for school food services. I've met many wonderful friends at that period in my career, and I loved it. I was working as a hospital dietitian in Las Vegas on a consulting basis, both for the General Hospital in Las Vegas as well as the mental hospital, which by that time had scaled down their operations significantly. When I was there, we were feeding about 1,000 patients a day. That is 3,000 meals a day, and that because of the very significant revolution in mental health practices, that enrollment or that census in the hospitals became much, much smaller. And over the years, there were a significant number of people who were involved with child nutrition, who also worked in a number of other fields related to child feeding as well as mental health. Well, and when 1975, I met John Bush, who had been a friend of mine, or the family had been well known in Ames because John's father was a physician and surgeon. And although I didn't actually know John at that time, he was a year older and in what we would have considered a very fast-moving crowd in the high school vernacular of the day. And so I didn't really know him, although he was a very good friend of my cousin Beezer Knapp. So anyhow, I worked with, I met John when he came to Albuquerque with the company that he was with after he had retired from the Air Force. And he and his younger son Jed came up to see me one weekend along with his sister Barbara, and we sort of renewed our acquaintance, and it grew into a friendship, which of course eventually became romance, and we married in November of '76. And I had 10 very fine, wonderful, happy years as a wife to John, and we had some marvelous experiences. Our children were all grown by that time, so we were able to plan interesting travel and experiences that neither one of us would have done as parents of smaller children. After John's death in 1986, we only had 10 years together, and I was induced or encouraged to return as a consultant to the child nutrition field, and I worked with a number of food service equipment manufacturers who made the heavy equipment that was used in many of the schools and restaurants and hospitals at that time. And that was a very happy experience for me also. I met some wonderful people. I visited many national conventions where I demonstrated this equipment, and I had a lot of fun doing it. This was a sideline to the child nutrition field, but very definitely closely related to it. So after I had retired, so to speak, from the field of dietetics, I became closely aligned with it again through this sort of adjunct field of consulting equipment manufacturers. I'm going to divert just a little bit here because at that time Karen was very actively involved in the travel business. She had become a travel agent working with some very close friends who had the travel business in Las Vegas. Well, actually, as time passed, Karen became not only the president, but the owner of the travel agency. And when she came to me after I had retired, John had died, and I was sort of casting about for what I would be doing with the rest of my life, and she encouraged me to come and work with her at the travel agency. Well, I'd never dreamed of being a travel agent, but I had so much fun doing it. And I began that work actually when I was over 60. So, I was sort of getting into the retirement category, but I still had a great deal of energy and ambition, so I became a full-fledged travel agent with Alpine Travel Service out of Las Vegas, New Mexico. So I'm going to cut off here so that I can talk to you a little bit more about my avocations, interested in doing things other than in my field. So I'll wait until I have a chance to collect my thoughts on what I want to comment to you about concerning the interest that I had in travel. I had this tied in very closely with some of the travel experiences that I've talked to you about, and it was just loads of fun. I really enjoyed it. I'm very grateful to Karen for giving me that opportunity to develop a whole new career interest. So I'm going to shut off right now, and I will be back with you a little bit later.